This engine had definitely seen some better days, and when the mechanic pulled the oil pan, the inside looked like a metal scrapyard that someone had poured black molasses all over. The mechanic who got underneath this one found rust holes in the frame, brake fluid soaking the entire inside of the wheel, and enough general chaos that he probably needed a minute before writing up the inspection report. The owner of this car was absolutely certain that the fuel system was fine because he'd had a full service done just a couple of years back. This customer had been on her way to drop some stuff off at a friend's place when she noticed the car pulling a little to one side. Turns out that the tire had already been fixed a couple of times. Customer states, been changing the oil every year since I bought it. She runs a little rough lately, but I think she just needs a tune-up. The mechanic working on this Prius had it in for a no-start concern and found a second car battery wired in back there, sitting in a whole jungle of cables. And this mechanic found the inside of this rim looking like it had lost a pretty serious argument with a concrete curb. Choo choo! This car rolled in for a routine inspection, and when the mechanic got underneath it, he found that a rust hole in the muffler had been sitting right next to the gas tank for long enough to melt away a pretty decent chunk of it. And this car came in for a simple oil change, when the mechanic pulled the drain plug and found something that looked a lot more like a green smoothie than engine oil. And you know, sometimes installing a brand new control arm does not pay off, especially if you have absolutely nowhere to attach it anymore. The owner of this car had apparently been putting off the brakes for quite a while now, and when the mechanic finally pulled the wheel, the rotor had gone from a brake rotor to more of a decorative metal piece in a rust museum. The mechanic who got underneath this truck found rust holes in the subframe, a locked up differential, and a frame that had been quietly falling apart for longer than what the owner wanted to admit. Customer states, heard a loud bang from the engine the other day, but she started right back up, so I figured it sorted itself out. This customer rolled in saying that he has some brake issues and that his friend usually helps him out with these kind of things, but he's gone for vacation and needs it sorted fast. The owner of this car had been on his way back from a weekend at the lake with some friends when he noticed the front end pulling hard to one side. The mechanic got it up on the lift and found a ball joint that had snapped clean off, with the whole wheel just hanging there. And you can never have too many clamps on your exhaust, right? Customer states, steering wheel wobbles a bit at higher speeds. The mechanic who sat down in this one found 3 GPS units on the dash, 2 window-mounted cup holders, a full set of wooden steering knobs, and more 12-volt adapters than what you'd find in a camping store. And not everyone who watches a YouTube tutorial on exhaust work should actually be doing exhaust work. The owner of this Subaru was pretty confident the car was fine and just needed a quick checkup before a road trip. The mechanic walked around back, noticed the whole rear end of the car sagging down, and found that the passenger side strut tower had rusted clean through the body. This is how you know you're a bit overdue on replacing your brake rotors. Customer states, just had the oil changed at the dealership last week. Now my oil light is on. Pretty sure they just forgot to reset the service reminder. The mechanic who pulled the valve cover on this one found the kind of sludge buildup that takes years of very committed neglect to achieve. This customer came in saying the trunk had been smelling a little musty lately and wanted it checked out. The trunk lid had been leaking so long that the trunk had basically transformed into a rain barrel. The owner of this car had just come back from a road trip to the mountains and said that his brakes now felt a bit different. But when he heard the price quote from the mechanic, he took off like a shot. This customer had been on his way to pick up some supplies for a construction job when he drove through what he described as a bit of a muddy area. The undercarriage came back with enough dried concrete packed into it to suggest the muddy area was more of an active pour site. And this is exactly why you should always double check what your neighbor means when he says, "Yeah, I strapped it back up, you're good to go." Customerstates had my buddy upgrade the rear suspension using some special grade stuff. Apparently, it's the same kind of stuff they used on the Moonlander. The drive shaft on this truck had clearly decided it was done taking direction from anyone, and the U-joint had enough play in it to suggest it had been like that for quite a while. The owner of this car had his engine in at a shop his nephew recommended as the best shop in America. The mechanic pulled ahead and found that someone had patched a crack in it with epoxy and called it a day. This customer had been on her way to a dentist appointment when she hit a hole in the road and heard a loud crack. The mechanic found multiple parts of the steering and suspension to be completely totaled. Customer came in saying that they have a small tire leak and wanted it fixed. The mechanic who sprayed some soapy water on this tire found foam bubbling up along the entire sidewall. Definitely a small leak, alright. Customer states, "My rear wiper has some incontinence issues." And this car came in with a mystery fluid leak from the drivetrain area, and when the mechanic got underneath it, he found a transmission mount bolt leaking blue fluid, in a place that blue fluid has absolutely no place to be. The mechanic who went to swap the oil filter on this one pulled it off and found the factory plastic protective sleeve still wrapped around it, and it had apparently been on there since the last oil change, causing the oil pump to go out. The owner of this car rolled in complaining about a clunking sound when going over bumps, but said that his buddy had fixed his shocks just last summer. Turns out this car already had its own regular mechanic, and he was not happy about being replaced. This old pickup looked pretty solid from the outside. The mechanic got underneath it and found the entire undercarriage covered in ambitious welds and a frame that had cracked right through in one spot, despite all the effort. This car came in with some electrical issues, and when the mechanic went to pull the battery cover, the positive cable just came with it, as it had snapped clean off the post. And this plastic bag had made it all the way from someone's grocery run straight into the CV axle boot, wrapped itself around it about 20 times, and was well on its way into the wheel bearing. The owner of this car was pretty sure the car was fine and just needed a standard service. The mechanic put it on the lift and found the entire undercarriage coated in engine oil, like it had been sweating it out for quite a while. This customer had been on his way to visit his parents for the holidays when the car started running a little rough on the highway. He pulled in at a shop nearby, and when the mechanic pulled the oil drain plug, out came something that looked a lot more like hot chocolate than motor oil. Customer states, "Fan's been making a little bit of a rattle lately, but she's not overheating or anything." And this is exactly how you know someone's been putting off a brake job for a little too long. Customer states, "Knocking sounds at all speeds." After 9 bottles of engine oil, I wonder what it might be. The owner of this car came in saying the car runs perfectly and just needs a small exhaust fix. The mechanic got underneath it and found a frame that was more rust than steel, an exhaust that was hanging on by hopes and dreams, and rust holes in places there should not be any holes at all. And this is how you know that the CV axle has officially handed in its resignation. Customer states, lost my keys about a month ago, so I've been getting in through the window, but the window mechanism is now broken too, so I improvised a little. And this tire had a lot more going on than just the one small hole it showed up with. This car came in for a routine safety inspection, and the mechanic only had to spend about 30 seconds underneath it before telling the customer that there wasn't much he could do to help. And this mechanic walked up to a customer's car in the parking lot and found the front wheel sitting pretty much inside the wheel well, after the lower control arm had rusted clean off its mount and left the whole wheel assembly to figure things out on its own. And this customer came in absolutely convinced he had just gotten ripped off at the gas station because he had just filled the tank and the fuel gauge was already reading empty. The owner of this car had been on his way to the airport when the AC stopped blowing cold and he figured it could wait until he got back. But by the time he took it to the shop, the refrigerant had been gone for a while and the compressor hadn't taken it well. And this customer rolled in saying he just needed a wheel alignment after a weekend trip with his buddies. The mechanic got underneath it to find an undercarriage that was roughly 50% car and 50% forest floor. Customer states, had some welding done on the frame a while back and the guy who did it said it was solid and that I just need some new shocks and she'll be good to go. The mechanic who looked at this oil pan found a JB weld repair that someone had clearly put some real effort into, but it was still leaking. And this is exactly how you know that someone has been driving on borrowed time for quite a while. The owner of this car was very confident the engine had just been properly serviced at a shop his coworker had vouched for. The mechanic pulled the timing chain cover and found the oil pump gear broken clean in half. The mechanic who pulled this wheel bearing found it had been running so hot for so long that pulling it off required a little more than just the usual tools. Customer states, I've got a little vibration at highway speeds, but I fixed the carrier bearing myself a few weeks ago and I just want it double checked. This car came in for a pretty routine brake job and the mechanic handled it in a pretty routine way, mostly at least. The customer had told the shop the SUV just needed a wheel alignment and maybe some new shocks. The mechanic put it on the lift, got underneath it, and found orange ratchet straps holding the rear suspension, wood pieces inside the springs, a loose steering linkage, sketchy wiring running in every direction possible, and a bent exhaust that looked kinda like a piece of modern art. The owner of this car came in complaining about the rear end feeling heavy and that the fuel economy had gone way down lately. The mechanic opened the trunk and found roughly 400 pounds of bottled water stacked to the roof. And this oil filter had been on there long enough that when the mechanic pulled it off and set it on the drain trolley, it looked less like a filter and more like a fossilized dinosaur turd. And this mechanic went around to check the axles on this one, found the first side looking reasonable enough, walked around to the passenger side and found the axle had completely parted ways with the wheel and was just hanging out. And this is exactly how you know that living in the Rust Belt your whole life might be slowly eating away at more than just your soul. The oil filter on this one had been installed so badly that by the time the mechanic pulled it, it had bent itself into a shape that it absolutely did not start its life as. The owner of this car was very confident the tune-up his cousin had done was the reason the car felt more powerful than ever. The mechanic started it up, heard it running on what sounded like 2.5 cylinders, walked around to the engine bay and found a spark plug hanging and dangling. This car came in after the mechanic noticed a faint wobble in the steering during the test drive and figured he'd throw it on the balancer just to be sure. And sure enough, the wheel had a little more personality than it was supposed to. Customer states, steering feels a little different since I bumped a traffic cone in the parking garage. Can't be anything serious, right? And this drive shaft had apparently decided that staying attached to the transfer case was more of a suggestion than a requirement. This mechanic had this car up for a brake inspection when he noticed the tires were wearing in a way that suggested the suspension had been doing something pretty creative for quite a while. The owner of this car came in saying everything was fine, just a small rattle from somewhere underneath. The mechanic found a section of the frame that had rusted through, snapped off, and taken a cable harness with it on the way down. And this customer came in saying he hit a branch on his way home from visiting some family. And this car had gotten some new CV axle boots installed at another shop. Whoever did them had skipped the part where you trim the rubber to length and just ran tie wraps around the ends instead. Fast work if nothing else. This car came in because the heater had stopped working entirely, and when the mechanic pulled the blower resistor, it looked like it had been marinating in salt water since the factory installed it. This car was in because it wouldn't move anywhere while in drive. The mechanic slipped it into drive and walked around to the side to have a look, and found a broken CV axle spinning freely without moving the wheels, meaning the power from the engine was going absolutely nowhere useful. And this oil pickup filter had been pulled from an engine and was so clogged with metallic debris and plastic chunks that it was barely a filter anymore. Seems like the engine had been running on pure optimism for quite a while. And this is exactly why you don't let your uncle, who loves conspiracy theories and alien hunting, borrow the car for a few months. This customer had been on his way back from a fishing trip when both the fuel gauge and temperature gauge started going up and down on their own, like they were having a conversation with each other. Customer declined all repairs, saying he'll just drive it on feel for a while. The owner of this truck had his neighbor pull the engine for him a few weekends ago. The neighbor said it'd be a quick job, but that was 6 weeks ago. The mechanic who dipped his finger into this oil pan found a dark, gooey substance with metallic glitter in it. The fun kind of glitter that an engine makes right before it stops working. Customer states, she just needs a couple of new tires and a little touching up. She's a diamond in the rough, I promise. The mechanic who got underneath this one found an undercarriage that had apparently been marinating in engine oil for a pretty long time. Whoever had serviced this car last had some explaining to do. The mechanic working on this one had been told by the customer that the car was running a little rough, but that he'd been keeping up with all his maintenance. The air filter told a slightly different story. The mechanic who pulled the wheels on this one found brake rotors that were so far past their service limit that he had to look twice to confirm they were still there. This car came in for a routine oil change, and when the mechanic cracked open the oil filter, it came out looking like something that had been through a very rough few years. The owner of this car had apparently handed some recent suspension work over to a neighbor who said he was pretty decent with cars. And this is what the mechanic found once he had the car on the lift. Customerstates bought it off a private seller last weekend. He said it was solid underneath and that it would pass an inspection without a doubt. And this car rolled in after the owner's uncle had insisted on doing a full service on it himself to help him save a bit of money. But the car had since developed quite an engine tick, and when the mechanic popped the oil filter out, it came out looking like it had been marinating in there since the car left the factory. The owner of this car had been putting off a brake inspection for quite a while, and when the mechanic finally pulled the rotor off, the rust had done enough work on its own that the center and the outer ring had decided to go their separate ways. Customer states, "My car feels a little sluggish when I really put my foot down. I think it might be something with the air intake." And this is how you know that rust really does not mess around when you give it enough time to get comfortable. This truck rolled in for a tire rotation when the mechanic pulled the first wheel and found a tire that had been working overtime on both edges and basically took a vacation in the middle. Turned out to be a classic case of worn out camber, which basically means the alignment had been far off for very long. And this customer had brought their car in saying the engine had been running really rough ever since their neighbor had done some work on the cooling system a few weeks back. The mechanic pulled the intake manifold and found it to be full of water. This truck came in for an oil change when the mechanic walked over to one of the wheels and found it held on by a single lug nut. The other four had apparently taken the day off. This car came in because the owner said the front end had been feeling a little loose lately. The mechanic got underneath, grabbed the front section of the undercarriage and found he could rock the entire thing up and down with his hands because the front frame section had rusted completely away from the rest of the car. Customer states, "Just need a quick tread depth check on all four tires." This car rolled in after the customer said the steering wheel wobbles a lot when he brakes. I wonder why. The owner of this truck came in saying, "I have some brake noise, but my uncle just checked them last month and said they were totally fine." This customer had been on his way home from a late shift for the past few weeks, noticing that the dashboard was getting harder and harder to see at night. The mechanic sat down and just turned the dashboard brightness knob from min to max and happily invoiced the customer for 2 hours worth of diagnosis work. Uh-oh. And this is exactly what happens when your nephew, who's apparently a great electrician, does some wiring work on the car. The horn now lives in the door lock. This car was in for a quick inspection before the owner was supposed to go on a longer road trip. The mechanic noticed something off with one of the wheels, and once he had it on the lift, he saw that the lower control arm had snapped off due to how rusty it was. And the owner of this truck came in saying the reverse lights had stopped working after his father-in-law had installed a new light bar and done the wiring, all by himself. This car came in with a check engine light and a rough idle, and when the mechanic pulled the O2 sensor and looked down into the catalytic converter, he found it completely packed with debris after it had fallen apart internally. The owner of this car came in saying she just wanted to know why the fuel gauge kept dropping faster than usual. The mechanic got underneath it and found that the undercarriage was pretty much all rust at this point, with one particularly ambitious piece of frame that had slowly worked its way straight through the gas tank. And this customer came in saying, "I've been getting this little hum at highway speeds, but my buddy drove it and said it felt totally fine to him." The mechanic who got underneath this one found a clutch that had clearly lived a very full life and was ready to retire. The owner had apparently been towing a small trailer back from a camping trip and had floored it up every hill on the way home. The mechanic working on this truck had lifted it up for what should have been a straightforward inspection when the back end of the truck decided it had other plans and just stayed where it was. The owner of this car was very confident it just needed a quick jump and would be fine after that. His neighbor disagreed and spent 20 minutes pushing him down the street with his own car before they both gave up and called the shop. Customer states, Exhaust has been a little louder than usual, but my cousin just did the whole system last month, so it's probably just settling in. The mechanic who got underneath this one found two problems fighting for his attention at the same time: a frame that had turned itself into Swiss cheese and a fuel leak generous enough to water a small garden. Customer states, truck's been a little rough on the highway lately, vibrates a bit, and since yesterday it just won't move anywhere anymore. This Honda CR-V had been sitting outside at a family member's lake house for a couple of winters while nobody was using it, and when the mechanic got underneath it, the suspension was looking like this. This car came in for a routine oil change when the mechanic pulled the dipstick to find what can only be described as a fresh chocolate milkshake brewing inside the engine. And this is how you know it might be time to stop putting off that brake job. The owner of this car had apparently done some brake work over the weekend, all by himself, but had to come in because the entire wheel was now locked up. And this car rolled in with some starting issues after a friend of the owner's had installed a new stereo and sound system in it. Looks great. Customer states, my nephew lowered it for me last weekend and it sits a little different now, but he says that's how it's supposed to look. Apparently, it's called stance. The owner of this Kawasaki mule had been using it to get around the property all summer, doing small jobs here and there, and had recently started hearing a ticking noise. The mechanic opened the hood to check it over and found there was no oil filter. This Infiniti came in with some suspension issues, and when the mechanic looked at it, he found the strut tower looking like this, with a full wrench welded right into it and all. Now that's a piece of art. Customer came in complaining about their transmission shifting a little rough, but that he's been told that's just how these ones are and asked for some new transmission fluid. This oil pan had a leak that had gotten to the point where it was no longer dripping, it was flowing. This car came in with a clunking sound from the front, and when the mechanic grabbed the wheel and moved it up and down, the ball joint was moving along with it in a way that ball joints are very much not supposed to move. The owner of this car rolled in saying that he had lost his camper on the highway while he was on vacation with his family, and this is what was left of the trailer hitch. Customer states, just need some new brake pads. The rotors are fine, my buddy checked them last month. And this is exactly the kind of thing that makes a mechanic grab an extra coffee and a cigarette before digging in. Customer states, I've got a couple of loose wires that need tidying up. Should be a 20-minute job, tops. And this car rolled in for a belt replacement when the mechanic grabbed the idler pulley and found it had absolutely zero interest in staying where it was supposed to be. Customer declined all repairs. This car came in with a suspension noise, and when the mechanic went to remove the control arm bushing, it was so dried out and hardened that the moment he popped it free, it launched itself to the other side of the garage. The owner of this car came in saying the rear end had been feeling a little springy lately and wanted it checked out. The mechanic got underneath it and found that someone had apparently decided that a bunch of chains was a great solution. Customer states, car makes a little rattling sound when I start it up cold, but once it warms up, it goes away. I think that's just how these engines are, right? The owner of this Mercury had apparently asked his best friend to have a look at some rust underneath a while back, and he had done what he could with what he had. The mechanic got underneath it and found the frame looking like this. The owner of this Hyundai came in saying everything was totally fine, just had a small noise from the rear and thought it probably just needs some grease. The mechanic grabbed the rear wheel and moved the entire rear axle in and out because it had rusted completely free off the frame. And this is how you know that your engine is not doing very well. This car rolled in because the owner said it had started pulling slightly to one side at highway speeds and wanted the alignment checked. The mechanic pulled the first wheel, found a tire with absolutely nothing left to offer, and then rocked the wheel and found the suspension had pretty much the same attitude. The mechanic who sat down in this one grabbed the steering wheel to adjust its position and it just kept going.